This episode is brought to you by Anytime Fitness. We may talk a whole lot about sports, but when it comes to keeping fit ourselves, there's definitely room for improvement. I hit this point early July. I was just like, I am not in good enough shape. I started trying to walk at least 15,000 steps a day or hiking or just anything to keep my legs moving. Now it's the end of 2023. I feel great. I had a physical 3 weeks ago, and the guy was like, "You're doing great. You're doing better than you were 3 years ago." I felt great. Whatever your goals are, progress is possible thanks to Anytime Fitness. Get a personalized plan and support from an expert coach anytime, anywhere. Visit anytimefitness.com to try Anytime Fitness for free. Start to train for your life. Terms, conditions, and restrictions apply. See website for details. This episode is brought to you by Read, Write, Own, Building the Next Era of the Internet, a new book from entrepreneur and startup investor Chris Dixon. If you're listening to this podcast, you know what it's like to be part of a community of fans. You value the people who play, perform, and create for everyone. Well, what if there are more ways to support them, more ways to be a fan? And what if you had even more ways to connect with the teams, artists, and other creators that you love? Even though creators make the internet valuable, how much value do they get for their work? Well, that's mostly up to a few big tech companies. Shouldn't creators get more from the platforms they make successful? More value, but also more say, more control, more ownership? Read, Write, Own explores an alternative future for the internet, one that reclaims control for creators, fans, listeners, and gamers, the people who not only use the internet, but make it useful. Read, Write, Own imagines an internet built by us for us. So order your copy of the book today or learn more at readwriteown.com.
All right, joining us now on Through the Ringer. You've seen her before. You know her. She is the great Nora Princiotti, and we're happy to have her back because we got to talk about the NFL season. And before we get into, all the conversations about who should be starting, what's going to happen, how we forecast the future of the NFL, I just want to start here. What were your takeaways from the Hall of Fame game? Were you as moved as everybody else, Nora? Did you talk about it? Are you still thinking about it? Did it really, kind of move the meter for you?
Tate, I didn't watch the Hall of Fame game.
I know. That's where I wanted to start. I don't think any of us watched the Hall of Fame game.
But I did watch some clips of the Hall of Fame game.
Good.
Well, no, I did watch some clips of the game, but that's not what I'm trying to talk about. I was moved by it. You know what I was moved by was DeMarcus Ware singing the national anthem, sort of as a tribute to Demaryius Thomas. Really, really touching, and he sounded really good. He has a great voice.
I like that, and I think that was actually a great takeaway from that game. But we are kind of in the, we're still in the dog days of summer.
Takeaway.
Right.
That's the only takeaway from the Hall of Fame game.
And singing, as we know through the Taylor Swift, the podcast that you have going on right now. So what good quality performance is, you know what I mean? So DeMarcus Ware, we see you, tip of the cap, all respect here on Through the Ringer. But we got more games. So we got games on Thursday night. We got Texans at Patriots. We got Vikings at Seahawks. Again, we're in the dog days of summer. It's preseason. As the years wane on, preseason is becoming less and less of a spectacle for people. They don't really talk too much about it, but I guess one of the news pegs we can talk about with these games is CJ Stroud. Will CJ Stroud start, and what can we take away if he does start from a preseason game, if anything?
Well, it seems like CJ Stroud might not just be kind of getting in position to start a preseason game, but it seems like he is pretty clearly becoming the presumptive starter there, which I find interesting for no other reason than they start with Baltimore. And if I had a rookie coming in there and I had a guy like Davis Mills, who's not flashy by any means, not someone who you're wanting to tie the future of your franchise to, but showed that he can be solid and stable. And I was looking at week one, dealing with the Ravens defense, which, I mean, it kind of got lost amid all the chaos that they were going through towards the end of last year and all the disappointments of that season and everything that was happening with Lamar Jackson. That defense, particularly after Roquan Smith got kind of clicked into the mix there, was pretty feisty.
Yeah.
So the idea of just letting Stroud loose and having him start against those guys in week one is certainly eye-popping. They must be seeing something. And as we know with these highly drafted rookies, with very few exceptions, they start eventually. So it's a little bit less like, oh my goodness, what must this mean? It means that they spent the draft pick on him, so he's going to play. But it just seems like they're making no attempt to kind of pretend anything might be otherwise. And he's getting tons and tons of starters reps, and they're really playing him through training camp. And it looks like in the preseason games, we'll see some of that in a way that would indicate that he's the guy.
Yeah, it used to be like the Tyrod Taylor role, right? Where they'd always have a de facto starter. They put in Tyrod Taylor. We're using him as the example right now. And then after, week 4, week 5, after they've dealt with and figured out that it might not be their year, then they go to the rookie quarterback and give him, kind of the baton, so to speak. So
Davis
CJ
Mills
Stroud,
is our guy, and CJ's got to earn that. And
exactly. Yeah, we're used to kind of that coach speak, but now we're at the point where it looks like CJ Stroud is the guy. So shout out to all the Buckeyes fans out there. Very exciting. He looks the part. That'll be good. On the flip side, we're going to be in New England. We're going to be seeing the Patriots, and there's a lot of conversation, obviously, after last year. You've seen the scuttlebutt, people talking about Bill Belichick. Is it a Brady thing? All that sort of stuff. What is kind of the ideal? What's a successful year look like for the Patriots, and maybe more specifically for Bill Belichick?
Oh, man. Well,
that's a loaded question, I know.
Well, so here's the challenge, is that the actual answer, I think, is a playoff win. That's the thing that Robert Kraft, right, keeps saying, that he's really frustrated by the fact that they haven't had one since Super Bowl 53. And the pedigree that they've set there, what you expect from a Bill Belichick team, it involves a lot of playoff wins. And so I think that is kind of the benchmark. The problem is I just don't know how they're going to get there, even if they are considerably better than they were last year. I was down there last week, and it was looking pretty good. The offense looked just functional in a way that it wasn't last year. They were repping some of the stuff, play action, the RPO game, letting Mac Jones audible, which was an interesting thing to me, not so much because it indicates trust, because it's not as though he wasn't allowed to make adjustments and they didn't think that he was ready for that, but particularly in camp, they spent a lot of last year just having to rep the same stuff and say that he wasn't allowed to make adjustments because they hadn't run the plays before. They were installing so much that they were saying to him, we don't know how to do this wide zone thing, so you have to go up there and run it how we're calling it because we just need the practice. Whereas it just seems so much more like a normal offensive training camp practice. So that's all great, right? And they've, that defense came off a great year last year. They should be gearing up for something even better. I mean, they got a situation contractually with Matt Judon squared away the other day. And so I think a lot of things look really positive there. The question is just, when you're in the division with the Bills, with the Jets now with Rodgers, with the Dolphins.
Yep.
Can you be a good team and still be fourth? And if you're fourth, even if you're above 500, the playoffs are no guarantee in the AFC. And then once you're there, who knows who you're going to be matched up against? It's hard to guarantee a win, obviously. If they go another season without that, we're probably hearing another round of Robert Kraft comments about wanting to get back to winning in the postseason, being really frustrated by that. So I think that they're in a pretty tough spot, just because I think things could get a lot better relative to last year, and they still might get over that hump.
Yeah, and it's also interesting because you mentioned last year, obviously we all remember it was like the Joe Judge, Matt Patricia, who's calling the plays, who's the offensive coordinator. You mentioned trying to install a whole system, and Mac Jones needing practice. Well, the coordinators needed practice as well, it looked like, at least from the outside looking in. And we got a very, tough situation, a very hairy situation. Not N'Keal Harry, but you know what I mean? A very, sticky situation for everyone involved there.
It's a very not N'Keal Harry situation.
Very not N'Keal Harry. He's out of there. But I feel like every Patriots fan I talk to tries to bring up him getting drafted and that whole thing. You mentioned Judon. That's good news for everybody. Matthew Judon, he apparently is looking dominant in camp so far. That's a good takeaway. Mac Jones looks more comfortable. That's been a takeaway as well. But there's also some conversation, some rumblings about Dalvin Cook, some interest there. Probably not going to be the case, but there's another guy I wanted to ask you about, Ezekiel Elliott. Is there a world in which Ezekiel Elliott gets into camp and is actually a positive contribution to this team?
So is there a world? Yeah, totally.
There's always a world, right?
There's always a world. They met with Dalvin Cook. Now it seems like, if anything, that's either the Jets or maybe he waits for there to be an injury somewhere. It seemed like all signs were pointing to him signing with the Jets, and then it's been a week and nothing's happened. So we'll have to see on that front. I do think, look, I think there's some degree where they want to be a little bit careful because they have guys like Ramondre Stevenson who are homegrown players who have done a lot and, taken a lot of punishment at that position. We've been talking a lot about just the strain of the running back position, and there's a little bit of sensitivity, I think, in general around those guys. So I wouldn't be surprised if in the front office there, they are taking into consideration just not upsetting any of the players who are already there. But they sniffed around Dalvin Cook, obviously. There's been some linkage with Elliott as well. I think the Cowboys have now started to talk a little bit about, a reunion's not out of the question. So I would put it as unlikely, but not impossible.
And they also the Patriots flirted with the idea of bringing back Stephon Gilmore, and the Cowboys also got into that situation. So It seems like both these teams are kind of flirting with the same players, and that, you do this, we do this, and they're almost in their own arms race against each other for some of these guys that are kind of, above board and have some name recognition, right? It sounds good when you say to your fan base, hey, we brought in Ezekiel Elliott. You remember the golden days of when he was with the Cowboys, right? You can kind of sell that idea. But like you said, if we get in a position where Bill Belichick finishes in fourth to get in the division, is there a world where we have, I'm going to keep using that phrase for us, but is there a world where Bill Belichick has some heat coming his way from Robert Kraft and the powers that be if it does go awry again?
I don't really think so.
Okay, that's fair.
I think there will be rounds and rounds of stories. I think if that happened, Kraft would make a few kind of spicy, maybe passive aggressive, if you want to call it that, comments. I think we would talk our heads off about it. I just, the more I think about it, and I've been sort of thinking about it off and on for like 3 years now as the Patriots have been going through it. Robert Kraft is a sentimental guy. Bill Belichick does not necessarily feed that part of him. He's a grumpy Gus. He's a hard guy to work with.
Little cantankerous, right? That's probably the best word
just
for
a little. Just sometimes he's got a little bee in his bonnet. But I don't think Robert Kraft wants to be the guy who fires Bill Belichick in New England. I think he is so sentimental about the dynasty there. Obviously, he had the most personal connection to Brady. But Brady, meanwhile, I don't know if you picked up on this a little bit, but Brady, for all of the talk about consternation and all of the conflict that led to his departure and existed between him and Bill Belichick over the years there, Brady has started to get really, really sentimental recently when he talks about the Patriots days. And I'm not saying that has any bearing on how Kraft feels, but I just think that those two kind of share that gene a little bit of getting warm and fuzzy about it. I think if Jonathan Kraft were running the team, it would be a really serious conversation of might Bill Belichick get fired? I could be totally wrong here, but I just have a really tough time seeing Robert Kraft pulling the trigger.
And you don't want to be the person that gets rid of Bill Belichick, arguably the greatest coach ever, and then let's say he does go somewhere else and is successful and turns things around, and then everyone's saying, you're the guy that got rid of our Hall of Fame coach. You've already dealt with that once, with losing a Hall of Fame quarterback, and he goes to a different franchise and wins a Super Bowl. So I think for the diehard Patriots fans, they do not want to see a day where Bill Belichick is kind of left, hung out to dry by the ownership. And, I was thinking, I did not watch the Hall of Fame game, but I did see clips. But then my wheels started spinning a little bit about Bill Belichick. Is there a world in which, and I think it's a rule that you can't get inducted in the Hall of Fame while you're active, but should we make a situation where Bill Belichick could get into the Hall of Fame while he's an active coach? I mean, it does feel like, if there's anyone that could probably cross that threshold, it's him and Andy Reid, and maybe both those guys could do that.
Okay, but Tate, you've maybe stumbled upon the one thing that could actually get the man fired, because if you do not think that every passing year Robert Kraft gets more and more and more concerned with his own Hall of Fame legacy, Jerry Jones getting in first was one thing. If Bill beat him,
that was step one. Yeah.
Whew.
Yeah.
Got a little spicy.
Yeah, it's getting spicy. A little hot in here. let's pivot from the AFC for a second. Let's go to the NFC. Let's talk about the Minnesota Vikings. Then I want to talk about our guy, the Danimal, Dan Campbell. But we'll start with the Vikings. Love the Danimal. Jordan Addison, he comes in. He's replacing Adam Thielen. They waived Dalvin Cook. We talked about that situation. There were some conversations about, how much he impacted their offense. We'll see what it looks like. Do you think Jordan Addison can be that essential cog kind of in that offense for the Vikings? And do we expect them to be a contender in the NFC North now?
They will be so interesting to watch because there's a version of that offense that could be really, really exciting, particularly if Addison is able to sort of be a field stretcher, is able to be someone who takes some pressure off of Justin Jefferson. They also, they get Hawkinson more and more into the mix there, and it's starting to look like a really strong group of pass catchers. The question to me that's interesting, there's sort of two questions. One, with them moving away from Dalvin Cook, are they going to be even more of a pass-friendly offense? I think that would be them leaning into their personnel in a good way, right? But if they do that, will the quarterback take advantage of all of the space that, in theory, if Addison gets up and running quickly, all of the space that could be created within that offense with him and Jefferson? Because to me, when I think about it, the possibilities are endless and it could be really, really, really exciting. But we are talking about a quarterback and one who, I think Kirk Cousins has gotten incrementally better and better and better.
And dare I say likable, right? I mean, Kirk Cousins, he had a bad Q score. He had a bad PR team working for him. And then all of a sudden he puts the chains on and he became a different guy quickly. And now it seems like, if anything, and even with the Netflix series, right, it feels like the narrative has turned in favor of Kirk Cousins. I don't want to get ahead of myself, but it feels a little bit different these days.
I have brought this up on multiple platforms at this point. When I turned on quarterback, maybe not the last thing I would have guessed, but certainly not anywhere near the top of predictions I would have made for how the show started would have been Kirk Cousins quoting Margaret Thatcher.
Yeah, right. Just perfect example. Yes.
I don't know that I will ever get over that. But here's the thing, right, is that one of the last images of Kirk Cousins we have is him throwing a check down on, 3rd and 8?
Yeah.
So if they open up all that space, if Kevin O'Connell gets everything cooking up the way that he sees it in his mind's eye, the next step is the quarterback taking advantage of it. And again, I think Kirk's experience is actually really valuable at this point. And he's a really efficient player, but for them to actually be a contender, I think he would have to find a way to balance that with a little bit more explosiveness and a little bit more risk taking in ways that don't just come from Justin Jefferson being Justin Jefferson. Because that'll get them pretty far. But given the regression that we're expecting for them in just win-loss based on the number of close games they won last year, I think they would have to take a decent step forward to actually be viewed as taking a huge step forward. And in that way, it comes down to Kirk.
And dare I say, Kirk Cousins is now the best quarterback in that division, right? I mean, obviously Aaron Rodgers had been there for, so long, and he kind of held that mantle. But now Kirk Cousins, I mean, you could argue Jared Goff, maybe Justin Fields, whoever you fancy. But objectively, Kirk Cousins is the best quarterback in the NFC North right now. So that gives you a leg up amongst the rest of the teams that you're going up against head-to-head. And one of those teams is the Detroit Lions. And I mentioned him before. The Motor City man himself, Dan Campbell, America fell in love with him last year in Hard Knocks. He obviously, when he first got the job, was talking about biting kneecaps. He is the king of quotes, and he's got a new quote. They asked him about the season tickets being sold out this year in Detroit, which is a great thing for all the Lions fans, the long-suffering Lions fans. And Dan Campbell was asked about the weight that he would feel because of that expectation. And he said, quote, "I feel wind underneath my freaking wings, man. I do not feel weight. I feel wind." I thought that was an amazing response. I wanted to get your response to his response. Weight versus wind. Do we feel good? Do we think that Dan Campbell and the Lions can take that next step?
Dan Campbell is the wind beneath my wings. It's always,
right.
It's just always a joy to be dealing with the Lions, to be thinking about Dan Campbell, reading some Dan Campbell quotes. I still view them as like I would pick them as the top team in that division. You're right to point out that Kirk probably is the more reliable quarterback. It's hard for me to separate from some of the system stuff there. But there's a lot of opportunity in the NFC. I do, like, not to be, Debbie Downer here, because again, I do think that the Lions should win that division. It will be an interesting year for them because he is so charismatic, and they have definitely the rebuild has gone forward in leaps and bounds so far. But their draft drew some criticism. And now we're going into a season where I wonder if the expectations will be just a little higher, where they actually have to do something. Otherwise, the shine starts to come off a little bit. I would hate to see that happen because I just think Dan Campbell is such a joy. I think it's real. I think it's authentic. So to a certain extent, people see through that and will continue to enjoy it because of that. But they got to win something.
Yeah, you got to win something. And it is, I think the fascinating football aspect of this team is that they had two guys last year in Jamal Williams and DeAndre Swift, and they together had 25 touchdowns, which sounds like a pretty good duo in your backfield. They say, we're off these guys. Jamal Williams now with the Saints talking bad about beignets and how he doesn't like beignets and it's just funnel cake, but that's a whole different conversation. But they get David Montgomery, they get Gibbs in the draft, and then Dan Campbell, again, the quote machine himself, he says that these guys are a quote-unquote two-headed monster and that he compared them to Mark Ingram and Alvin Kamara back with the Saints, that duo. So it's going to be new faces in an unfamiliar place. But if those two guys can have big seasons, does that really change the tone if they can have sort of a ground game even better than they had last year?
It would go a long way. I think for them, it's really about the defense, because that was what held them back last year. And I think that's the side of the ball that needs to make some real progress for them to kind of move from exciting upstart team to actual contender. And again, you can do that pretty quickly in the NFC right now. And particularly in their division, I think the path is totally open. But I just think that they're going to have to get some stops.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to talk about another team in the NFC that I think that their quarterback slowly became America's sweetheart last year. Everyone fell in love with him. He's been around for a while. His name is Geno Smith. And the Seahawks, I mean, there's a lot of, excitement about the fact that they were so, well off without Russell Wilson last year. You and I talked about Russell Wilson in future. We don't have to get into that again. But from the Geno side, do we think that the Seahawks can surprise and shock the world again? Do we think that Geno can have another big year?
I think he can totally have another big year. I mean, I think he can get better. It won't be as much of a surprise just because everybody sort of went through that last year, but it's easy, I think, to forget because he was so quickly effective there, and it was this thing that totally caught the league by surprise early on last season. It's easy to forget that this is his first real, true, full offseason, knowing that the job is his and being able to focus on that and know where he's going to be. That's a kind of stability that Geno Smith has basically never had. He tweeted about it a long time ago, I think like maybe right as the regular season was ending or the playoffs were ending or something like that last year, and just was talking about how excited he was to have that kind of stability and how he thought that it would make him a much better player. So I would expect him to make significant strides. I don't know that it'll have the same like taking the league by storm thing. And I still think that they are going to have a tough bit of sledding because of how they match up with the 49ers in the division. But in general, yes, I think they can get even better.
Yeah, and it's it's not too bad to be the second best team in the NFC West if things work out that way. And I think you make a great point about Geno. I mean, you feel less like a mercenary. You feel like you have some security. The locker room obviously loves him. They kind of the fact that the locker room had such an affinity for him, I feel like helped him get the job in the first place.
Totally.
Because it felt like Drew Lock was maybe who ownership was trying to push onto the team. And they said, no, our quarterback is Geno Smith. And I'm happy for him, excited to see that. It'll be a fun division race. Obviously, the 49ers are a favorite for a lot of people. We can talk about them at a later date. I want to talk about another team in the NFC because this is personal to me. And we talked about C.J. Stroud at the top, but we got to talk about the number one pick, Bryce Young. He's expected to be the starter. The team has really bought into him being the starter. Brian Burns said he kind of changed the way that they approach the locker room as a team, which is a good thing to hear about a rookie. So what are your expectations for Bryce Young, and what can we try to look for in his first year, and how do we not put too much on him too early?
I don't know what to expect. He's an outlier player. Like that's the thing. What if I were a Panthers fan, what I would expect is that there's a really fascinating season upon you guys because he's 5'10" and 200 pounds. Like we just don't get this a whole lot. Now, a lot of the questions there actually aren't really year one questions, right? Because I think Bryce Young showed enough as a college player to tell us that he didn't have a lot of tipped ball issues. It seems like he can see the middle of the field and pass the middle of the field just fine. So in terms of the initial acclimation to the NFL, I do have high hopes because his college tape's really good. And it doesn't seem like the height weight concerns show up on his film a ton. The question is just, can he stand up to the physical rigors? And some of that is immediate, right? These guys are big that he's going to be playing against. More so that's over the course of 2, 3, 4 years, an entire career. But there's a real element of mystery when you have a player enter the league who's really different from anyone who's been in that position before. So I'm just really excited to watch it. In general, I think the Panthers are a really interesting team and a team with a lot of promise, but Young has a really wide spectrum of outcomes.
Yeah, the defense is shored up. I think the defense is going to be fine. It's probably going to be one of the better defenses in all of the NFL. But like you said, I saw a video from training camp. The offensive line stood up, Nora, and I could not see Bryce Young. And then I saw them reset, and there he was. And I think that is why when even going into the draft, right, his only comparison, and we had it in the draft guide for the Ringer, was Stephen Curry, which Stephen Curry does not play football. So he is so unique. He is such an outlier. And also Panthers fans, the last time they had this number one pick, it happened to be a 6'6", 260-pound, fullback, halfback, quarterback, any back
you could usually see Cam behind the line.
Yeah, you could always see Cam, and he threw for 400 yards in his first game as a Panther, and I think the fans immediately said, okay, we have our quarterback. So it might be a different experience, but like you said, it'll be an intriguing experience at some level, and hopefully for Bryce, he can make some strides in the right direction, stay healthy, but it will be fun because the NFC South in general feels very open. I have to ask about that division just in general. Is there a team that you like? I mean, the Buccaneers have Baker Mayfield. The Falcons have some questions about Desmond Ridder. The Panthers, obviously, you have a rookie number one pick quarterback. And then you have the New Orleans Saints with the Beignet Bandit himself, Jamal Williams. So is there any team in the NFC South that you say, I kind of like what they got going on? Because the division seems, last year it was a mess, and it seems like it could be a mess again.
Yeah, it's a fascinating group of quarterbacks. It's a really interesting group of teams, right? Like I am a Falcons enthusiast.
I like it.
I would say. I just think the way that they have sort of imported the Titans' philosophy of just getting a bunch of big dudes and playing a different, more old school style in a league that has gotten smaller at a lot of positions, it's gotten faster and leaner and just zigging when everybody else is zagging. I mostly just think it's a really interesting thing to watch, but now with just the sheer amount of talent they have at the skill positions, I think they will be a very fun offense at the very least. If things click with Bryce Young, though, like, it's completely not out of the realm of possibility that the Panthers would win that division. Yeah. And I think there's a fairly easy situation that could play out where he has a couple good games and they round into a team that looks like the favorites there, just because I do think it is the most, if you sort of ignore some of the questions about the quarterback, which obviously is a big caveat, that is the most well-rounded roster. And then the funny thing is, like, the Bucks were a tire fire and my least favorite team in the entire league to watch last year. It's not a bad list of players.
Yeah, there's still some talent down in Tampa Bay, right?
Talking yourself into anyone.
Right. You have some whiplash too, right? If you're a Buccaneers fan, you go from Tom Brady, the greatest quarterback of all time, to Baker Mayfield, who was a former number 1 pick. He had a nice little resurgence last year with the Rams for a little bit. So maybe Baker can find some magic down there. That's its own separate conversation. I did want to point out Arthur Smith, the head coach of the Falcons. Great mustache right now. And that mustache and that confidence, it's making me feel like Atlanta could be a team that would be in the mix. So I like that pick. And it leads me to my next question for you. What are your bold predictions for the 2023 NFL season? It can be, DeMarcus Ware might sing another national anthem. I don't know what it may be in your arsenal. But what is a bold prediction that you're saying to yourself, I think this could happen this season?
So I'll give you a couple. Stephen Ruiz and I were talking about this on the Ringer NFL show the other day. So one is that I think we're going to have the first 2,000-yard receiving season in the regular season, just because it's time. Like, we're just building to it now. At the 17th game, Justin Jefferson, I think, would be my pick, just because he's 3 years ago. It was 1,400 yards. Then it was 16. Then it was 18. It just feels like he's building to it. The question there would be, does Addison take away some of the targets? But I can also see a world in which he just opens the whole thing up for them. I do think they may go away from the run game a little bit, as we talked about, in which case that could increase the volume. The other guy that Steven and I talked about was the last receiver to hit 2,000 receiving yards in a season, including postseason, which would not do it. But that is Cooper Kupp, who is now dealing with a little bit of a health situation. So we'll see how that pans out and if that affects any availability. The Rams are not in great shape roster-wise, obviously, but it's possible that works in his favor in the sense that he's just the guy and he is the target, basically, down in and down out. So those are the guys that we sort of talked about with that. But just the way the league has continued to head, being more and more pass-friendly and then adding another game, it's going to happen eventually. So why not this year? And then the other one that I gave Steven was that I think Tom Brady might unretire.
Yeah, I like that one. That's my head's been there, since he announced the second retirement. It does feel, especially when Tom Brady talks about the Miami Dolphins, he talks about them from it's like he has a reverence or he's like almost flirting with them, and we obviously know that they have in the past. And then also you have the Raiders, right? That's the other one with Jimmy G.
Well,
what team would you expect him to come back for? Yeah, please.
Here's the thing with Las Vegas is that when the Commanders sale was going through, part of that sale was that the league enacted a new rule that basically says if you are a player or an employee of a team, you may not have equity in the team. Some fuzzy edges to that I don't totally get. For instance, Jerry Jones is at least nominally an employee of the Cowboys, but he also owns them. So I guess you can get grandfathered in that way. But if you work for a team, if you get hired by the team, they can't give you a chunk of the team as part of that agreement. And so most of the owners, as they're passing this through, are like, okay, yeah, whatever. Mark Davis is like, no, I don't want to do this because I'm trying to hire Tom Brady as an executive / team owner. And as part of that agreement, I've told him that he can have all of this equity in the Raiders. Like, stop. You guys are messing up my plans. And the rest of the owners are like, tough.
They're like, we know.
Davis.
Yes.
Yeah, like, we don't care.
We see it. Yes.
And he was really upset about it. But the rule passed anyway, and now that's not an option for them. So I imagine that means that the Brady thing, in terms of being a part exec, part owner, is off the table. And if he's not an owner, that means that he could come back and play. And if he could come back and play and he can't do it, like, all of it just seems to be circling. Yeah, Jimmy Garoppolo's health. Like, come on. The two teams that you mentioned, which I agree with you, are the two teams where there's just so much smoke that there at some point seems like there might be fire around them grabbing Brady. The Dolphins and the Raiders. Both of them have quarterbacks with fairly precarious health situations.
Absolutely.
So I'm just connecting the dots.
Yeah, right. And obviously Tom Brady is tuned to what's happening in the league. And it would honestly be kind of a sick joke for Jimmy Garoppolo if Tom Brady comes out of retirement and then literally makes him the backup again. If I was Jimmy Garoppolo's agent, I would be furious. But I think he and Tom Brady had the same agent, so right. I think they actually won't matter at all. So I think it'll work out fine for everybody. But I like that. That's a bold prediction. That's what we're here for this. For this show, that's what we want. We want bold predictions. And Tom Brady coming back would be great for everybody. Next big picture question for you. What has been your favorite news out of NFL training camp so far? It can be weird. It can be wonky. It can be, actually related to the football itself. But what's something that came out and you're saying, oh, that has my attention. Interesting.
I mean, it's got to be Hackett Gate, the Hackett job, whatever we're calling it. Peyton versus Hackett.
Yeah, it's a lot going on there.
The gift that keeps on giving. I mean,
right.
the latest.
Just when you think it's over, it just keeps circling back around, right? There's more comments. It keeps circling
back, and I think they play in week 5, so it's really not that far away. Rodgers jumping into the fray, Sean Payton apologizing. I mean, there's quite a bit of juice there. I think we're going to see some Hard Knocks covering it, maybe, hopefully.
Please.
That's starting soon, so that has been the most fun. I all of the little offshoots of that story are fascinating. Like, there've been a bunch of reporters who have argued back and forth over, did Sean Payton mean to do it? Like, is there intention behind everything he does? Is he playing 3-dimensional chess, or like, did he just speak off the cuff and step in it a little bit? That's been my favorite story.
I think it's a lot of candor from Sean Payton. I think he was also trying to, I think maybe make a little bit of a splash with his own team to say, we have a fall guy, right? It's nice when you have a fall guy, and they decided that the fall guy was going to be the head coach. Obviously, Russell Wilson and Hackett did not get along very well. Most people read the tea leaves and say that Hackett was probably brought to Denver with the idea that they were going to get Aaron Rodgers because of their relationship. Obviously, Russell Wilson is not Aaron Rodgers, so there's a lot to dissect there. And then you throw in the fact that Aaron Rodgers did the thing that you always works in sports when you say you broke the code, right? As soon as you say someone breaks the code, we're all tuned in. We're all trying to figure out what the code is. We're all looking up our books to see, what page is this code on. And he broke the coach's code according to Aaron Rodgers, and then the drama ensues. So it's been great fodder. It's been great entertainment, and kudos to Aaron Rodgers, by the way. Quickly, we can just say that. He goes to New York, and immediately he's got big stories coming out. He's got Hard Knocks coming to town. For as much as people said that he needed to be in a small market, it feels like Aaron Rodgers actually likes being in New York City. Am I right about that?
Well, so first of all, I've been rewatching season 1 of The Wire, and if we know anything, it's that a man's got to have a code.
Yes, always.
Rodgers, I have said my fair share of critical things of Aaron Rodgers, mostly related to his relationship with the scientific method. I will say one thing for the guy that I absolutely mean from the heart. Aaron Rodgers seems like a really good friend. Aaron Rodgers seems like if you are his guy and he likes you and he cares about you, he will go out on a limb for you. He will protect you. He will defend you. He will get you signed to the Jets, and
he'll get you a job.
Yeah. He will call Sean Payton insecure on your behalf. And friendship is really important. So credit where it's due. Aaron Rodgers seems like a good guy to have in your corner. And yeah, I mean, he's living it up. He's totally living it up. The games have not started yet, so we'll see what's in store there. But all of the reporting from camp there all has to do with he's so mentally advanced
engaged.
as far as just like
Right.
he's engaged, he's making all the checks, he knows all the plays, he's coaching the receivers, he's a coach on the field, like all of the stuff that you would sort of expect if you sign Aaron Rodgers, but he's checking all of those boxes, and it seems like it's not just that he's really enjoying being here. It does seem like the team is really enjoying having him there.
I'm enjoying the conversations around Aaron Rodgers being in New York, and I like the honeymoon period. I think it's good for everybody. It's probably good for Rodgers. I want to now flip it and talk about the opposite of a honeymoon period. It feels like more, akin to a divorce at this point, and that is, of course, Jonathan Taylor versus the Colts. There has been a lot of tweeting. There's been a lot of quotes and comments and, owners, chiming in with his thoughts. You got Ryan Poles now chiming in with his thoughts. They signed Kenyon Drake, which, you kind of can, see that they're saying we've found another running back at this point. How do we sift through this whole Jonathan Taylor controversy at this point?
It's pretty bad.
It's bad. I think it's bad.
Yeah, I mean, if all of these situations are different, right? And I think there's
they look unserious about winning at this point. You know what I mean? If you're a Colts fan and you see this whole thing playing out, you're saying, why are we doing this? And then also, your owner is saving a whale for $20 million, and that's also in the news, right? So there's money around. There's always money in the banana stand.
Right.
There's
right.
money
or
for a whale, but not for our running back. It seems very
strange. Or in the luxury tour bus or whatever it was.
Right.
Well, so that's the thing. You said that they seem unserious about winning. There was a headline in the Indy Star today, maybe or yesterday, very recently, that was basically the same thing. It said it was something like, Colts don't seem like they're serious about winning this year. And I'm curious to see if that ends up being a dominant enough story in the media to make a difference and put some pressure on the team. Normally, I would say that stuff doesn't really matter because I think front offices are generally pretty adept at just ignoring it and doing whatever they want to do. I don't know that owners are, though. And this situation so clearly involves Jim Irsay and was so clearly, made worse than it already was by him going on and being like, basically, doesn't matter who's on the team, doesn't matter who lives or dies, like Colts football goes on. I'm obviously
he's basically like, we're all going to be forgotten when we die. It was very nihilistic of him, but
it was a little bit of like metal Kyle Shanahan.
Yes.
We could all be dead by next week, but
right.
It was specifically pointed at the star running back of his team, who I'm sure if you're Chris Ballard, you're going like, oh my gosh, I really planned on having Jonathan Taylor hopefully have a bounce back season this year. He's still important enough to the team where I would think that they would try to come to some sort of agreement, just something that can at least make him happy. But that one is not as clear cut as I would say even like Josh Jacobs, still not with the Raiders. But the thing is, that to me follows a very like linear sort of path of how I think it'll play out. Because now, because he hasn't signed, he's not getting fined. As soon as the season starts, he would start getting like losing massive amounts of money for holding out. So maybe, there's some uncertainty in, will they give him a little something to make him happy or whatever? But Josh Jacobs, I would say 95% certainty will come back and make $10 million and play for the Raiders and feel good about having gotten training camp off. Or maybe it'll be a little sooner than that and they'll give him a little more money to make that happen or whatever. But like essentially that feels very rational. It feels like everybody doing things that are in their clear interest. This thing with Jonathan Taylor has just gotten like, there's just too many feelings. It's too personal. There's too much weirdness to make it totally make sense.
Yeah, and is there a world, like you said, probably the reality is Josh Jacobs will go back to Las Vegas, play with the Raiders. They won't have to rescind the tag for him. But is there like a team like the Chiefs or the Broncos? Is there a team out there that makes sense if they get Josh Jacobs into the fold for them, that it takes them to the next level where, if you're a contender for a Super Bowl, you get a guy who can come in and produce to that level. Now you're the favorite to win the Super Bowl all of a sudden.
As a trade, or if the Raiders rescinded the tag?
If they rescind or trade, like what is there a world in which Josh Jacobs does suit up somewhere else? I guess is the easiest way to put it.
I have a hard time seeing that, just because I don't think that he's getting, so those teams like the Broncos or the Chiefs would not pay the tag number for him. Mm-hmm. So it would either have to be a trade agreement with enough compensation so that maybe the Raiders would eat some of it, which feels like a hard place to get to this late in the game, or they would have to rescind the tag, which I just find really, really unlikely, because he matters to that offense, and especially with what they're going through with Jimmy, who not only has the health situation, but has been throwing a lot of interceptions at camp. You need a running game there. So I have a hard time putting together the situation where he is valuable enough to one of those other teams for them to pay what would make it worthwhile, or for the situation to get bad enough where the Raiders would just rescind the tag.
Yeah, it does feel like the only way that makes any sense is if Tom Brady's going to come back and play quarterback and then throw the ball. So, or maybe that's your pitch to Josh Jacobs, that you could be playing with Tom Brady, and he says, you know what, I'll just sign the tag and I'll come back and I'll play with you guys, and the rest will be history. Do we think that this drama with the running backs, obviously Saquon was kind of the big storyline here, but I mean Dalvin Cook, Ezekiel Elliott, all these guys, do we think that the conversation about the quote-unquote disrespect of the position will drag on into the season, and we're going to have even more of these conversations? Like, it does feel like it almost feels like the running backs are going to have to form a union or something. I mean, you know what I mean? It does feel like the drama is just continuing, and it feels like it's adding up over and over.
I think we will hear less about it during the season, and then
during the actual
quite
games,
a bit about it next offseason. One, because, I mean, every single one of these guys who got tagged, right, where they didn't come to a long-term agreement, we're just going to be back at it next year. And there are going to be, I think, larger conversations when that happens, because this experience will have sort of prompted some thinking and maybe a little bit of organization. I mean, I am skeptical about the potential for something like a running back union to come together. But if something like that is going to happen, if there are going to be more Zoom calls, right, there's going to be a lot of opportunity for those guys to sort of set that stuff up ahead of next offseason and ahead of the tag deadlines and all of those benchmarks. So I think that we will hear a little bit about it during the regular season, in the sense that I think one of the interesting storylines to follow throughout the league will be the role of the running game. And if that pendulum is maybe swinging back a little bit, which is a related but not identical issue. And then next offseason, I think we will be talking about running backs all the time.
Yeah. I think you're spot on there, and we do talk about running backs when there's drama and this is happening, but we always talk about quarterbacks. So I do have to ask you, our last NFL thing, Joe Burrow. Obviously, that was a tough situation. You hate to see injuries. Joe Burrow, even his, Jamar Chase was talking about he doesn't even know who Pat Mahomes is. There's only one quarterback that's the best quarterback, right? There's all those conversations going into the season. How impacted are the Bengals, and how much are we kind of waiting on pins and needles to figure out how, when will Joe Burrow be back to being Joe Burrow is, I guess, the bigger question, and how much are we watching that as it develops over time?
Like crazy. I mean, it's the biggest. I think that's the biggest sort of.
It's the biggest question mark we have, right? In the entire
going
sport.
Into the season.
Yep.
Particularly because that type of calf thing can really linger. It's the type of thing that can get re-aggravated really easily. So, can they handle missing Joe Burrow for a game or two? Totally. Can they handle Joe Burrow being not at his best for a significant portion of the season, or it just being something that lingers and is always up in the air? That's a yikes moment. And in a conference where the competition is so fierce because of all those great quarterbacks and because the AFC is just so stacked, there is not a lot of room for error. So if I were there, I would be nervous.
Yeah, I'm nervous for all the Bengals fans out there, but I hope that Joe Burrow comes back, proves us all wrong, gets back to 100%. That's all we can hope for. I'm
also just sad. Like, Joe Burrow is the coolest person in the NFL. and I want him to be healthy so that he can be like around and wearing Cartier sunglasses.
Right, and just having a great time, and that's all that we want here. We want people to stay healthy, of course. One last thing, Nora, before I let you go. I know I've just been throwing out NFL topics at you, but this has been happening in real time. In case you missed it, college football is dominating a conference realignment at the college level. The Pac-12 is now the Pac-4 at this point, based on all reports. The Big 12, the Big 10, they're poaching teams. Now there's 4 teams left: Cal, Stanford, Washington State, Oregon State. Just as you're watching this, obviously at the pro level, the feeder system into the NFL is obviously college football. How much impact is this going to have on the NFL, if any? And what was your big takeaway seeing all this from, the pro level and just seeing the chaos that's happening on the college level?
Well, I do think because, and you follow this so much more closely than I do, but because with so much of the realignment, the SEC has been mostly like, it seems like they are sort of stable and consistent and keep chugging along for the most part. Mm-hmm. And I wonder, like, I've never asked anybody this question, but they are so, like, those schools, particularly Georgia, Alabama, like, they're just so dominant as feeder pipelines to the NFL right now. And I wonder if there's anything to be said for just the consistency of scouts getting down there and having the same people and like all of the logistics being consistent. It has so much to do with just the kids who go to those programs and the pipeline that, like, it's hard for me to see that being a 1-to-1. And largely, at least up to this point, the population of, like, the feeder system for the NFL is great. They're doing just fine with college football, at least as it is right now. But it will be interesting to see because you hear so much from coaches about the lead up into the draft and the draft process, about relationships really, really, really mattering. And whenever there's sort of like upheaval and change, people always change roles, and some of that I think does go through the spin cycle a little bit. So maybe there's a little bit of an influence there. But that would be an interesting thing to look into a little bit.
Yeah, it's kind of wild. We're getting to the world where it's just probably going to be 2 or 3 super conferences where there's 20 member schools. They're 3,000 miles apart. It's quicker to fly to London than it is to fly from, Rutgers to Oregon. Yet that's going to be a regular thing that's going to be happening in this theoretical Big Ten that we're going to exist in. And there's also a world, with the Pac-4 that exists right now. I mean, there's a world in which Cal might say, we don't even want to have sports anymore. We might just get rid of our athletic department as a whole and just be an academic institution with no sports teams. That's how crazy and warped the reality is in college sports right now. So the landscape is a mess. Like you mentioned with the SEC, there's more movement to come, and nobody knows what's going to happen. So it's just, we're all just kind of watching back and watching the building explode, so to speak.
There's also this is totally separate from the way that we've been having this conversation, but there are broader conversations in academia, right, about the value of prioritizing sports the way that they do. and how that influences who you admit to colleges, right? There was just that big study about how like financial privilege influences who gets into the Ivies and really elite schools, but there's some analogous effect at like big sports schools, or there are some, you know, Duke, Stanford, like schools that are incredibly good sports schools also fall into that group as well. So there are so many different like entry points for change. And it is a fascinating thing because like I don't really follow college football very closely, but I follow it as the NFL sees it. Mm-hmm. And for a long time, like that's just been a really, really, really steady thing for them. They haven't made in a lot of ways because they don't have to pay for their own farm system. It's a steady stream.
They're just bears and they wait for the salmon. Yeah.
And for all that we talk about the differences in the games, like the players arrive well coached, generally ready for the types of environments that they're going to be into, and you know, weight trained, strength and conditioning, like all of that stuff, they're pretty ready to enter the pros without the NFL really having to spend a dime. So if generally speaking, I don't think the league is a huge fan of change at the college level because the system works so well for them.
Yeah, honestly, these teams and these programs and these schools, they may need someone like an NFL to kind of interject themselves. And honestly, Rick Pitino had the best idea that I've heard. I mean, we've talked about it before, but Rick Pitino was like, let these football teams make their own conference. The football teams play in this super conference, and then everybody else stays in their regional conferences. And that makes it so the field hockey team doesn't have to fly from Eugene, you know, all the way to Piscataway, New Jersey, right? I mean, that does not make much sense logistically. And the poor field hockey players and all the Olympic sports teams, I mean, they're going to be
well, they have to go to Piscataway, so
you got to go to Piscataway, so it's going to be a long trip for everybody. It doesn't make much sense, but you know, that's the world that we live in, the new era, the new landscape, all that sort of stuff. Nora, thanks so much for coming on the show, for breaking down some of these NFL topics. We really appreciate it. We'll have you back on as we get closer to the season, training camp, you know, as it unveils and rolls out. Yet again, I want you to plug all the stuff that you're doing on theringer.com and the podcast space and all that sort of stuff, and then we'll let everybody get out of here and take a breath and maybe go, you know, read about Aaron Rodgers and what he's got going on with Hard Knocks.
Well, first of all, Tate, thank you so much for having me. I'm laughing because the last time that I was on with you, I made this whole thing about like I just moved and we were going to decorate my office.
Yeah,
it looks good. Blank wall behind me. So I'm looking forward to the next time we're back. Like it's just going to keep, I'm just never going to do it. Or someday I will and it'll be so triumphant. I am. You can hear me on the Ringer NFL show with Stephen Ruiz. We're doing a lot of great stuff through training camp. On Every Single Album with Nathan Hubbard, we have our last installment of our Summer of Taylor series coming next week. And I've also had a lot of fun over the last week being part of our 20th anniversary of the OC coverage. So I wrote a story about the soundtrack that's on theringer.com and have a podcast with Jody Walker on the Ringer Dish feed, as well as an episode of the Prestige TV podcast with Joanna Robinson and Juliette Littman.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, you're everywhere.
Lots of good stuff.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff. Go sift through that. Go read all that. Go listen to all that. It's all good stuff. Nora, thanks so much for coming on Through the Ringer, and we will have you back as we get closer to the season. And who knows, maybe next time you got like at least I'll give you this Muggsy Bogues jersey to put behind you. Who knows? We'll figure out something. Thanks, Nora.
Do that. Bye, Tate.